Hi, everyone. My name is Laura and I'm pleased to welcome you to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and our monthly webinar series, Climate Conversations, Pathways to Action. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to view right after the event. If you would like to ask questions, please submit them in the Slido box below the video at any time, and we'll incorporate them into the Q&A section of our programming. We also encourage you to participate in the polls that will appear in the same location and to give your feedback after the event in the survey linked above the video. For today's climate conversation, we will be having a timely discussion on the impact of multiple disasters on housing. Our moderator today is Christopher Flavelle, a reporter at the New York Times, where he focuses on how governments, businesses, and communities try and often struggle to adapt to climate change. He has written extensively about insurance, building standards, migration, groundwater management, and geoengineering, among other topics. Chris, over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Great to be here. We got a great panel for everyone today, and my job will be to get the conversation started and try to talk as little as I can. I'm just going to set this up. No one, I think, attending this event will be surprised to hear that housing and climate change are separately two of the defining crises of our time, as one of our panelists put it to me this week. Housing, of course, getting more expensive, painfully so, and climate change becoming worse in ever new ways. And they overlap, right? Climate change is making the housing crisis worse by destroying homes, stretching the workforce, people who build and repair homes, making insurance more expensive, and straining federal disaster aid. And the damage goes the other way as well. You could argue that as we build more housing in high-risk areas in a response to the housing crisis, the damage from weather disasters increases as a result. So the conversation today will focus on a lot of things. I think we'll talk about infrastructure, insurance, federal disaster policy, building codes, and whatever else comes up. That will be up to our two excellent panelists. Let me introduce them now. Tracy Kijewski-Correa is the William J. Pulte Director of the Pulte Institute for Global Development at Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. She's a professor of civil engineering and global affairs. Her research focuses on enhancing resilience and sustainability for hazard-exposed communities, with emphasis on climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. She's also the co-author of the National Academy's recent consensus study report, Compounding Disasters in Gulf Coast Communities, Impacts, Findings, and Lessons Learned. Carlos Martín is project director of the Remodeling Futures program at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies and incoming vice president for research and policy engagement at Resources for the Future. He's led housing research and policy analysis for over 25 years in public, academic, and civil sector positions. He's served on multiple National Academies committees, including the committees on accelerating decarbonization and on measuring community resilience. Welcome to both of you. I want to start by asking each of you just to discuss what drew you and what draws you to this work. Tracy, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for that. And hello, everyone. I think for me, my origin story, in full disclosure, I was 10 years old when the Mexico City earthquake occurred. And that was an eye-opener for me as a young child and a call to be a structural engineer. Since then, I have done, 2 decades now of reconnaissance after some of the biggest disasters, including the 2010 Haiti earthquake. So I get to see the morning after these events, and I have conversations on a family's worst day, right? The worst day of their lives. And as I direct now the NSF-funded STEER network that collects this data and documents these experiences, I'm seeing way too many worst days. And unfortunately, the recurring theme in all of that is housing, the greatest vulnerability that I've seen in this 20 plus years of doing this work. And that's what's brought me here today.
All right, Carlos.
Thanks for having us. And I think Dr. Kijewski-Correa and I have very similar stories because we're both trained in the built environment. I'm also trained as an architect and a civil and environmental engineer. And I came into housing fairly quickly. Right after grad school, I worked at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I was always very concerned about how the physical quality of our housing affects life outcomes for the people who live in them, for all of the households. And so originally, I actually started most of my work in climate mitigation on decarbonization and energy efficiency. And unfortunately, as Tracy mentioned, we just have seen so many more incidents that I started doing climate adaptation work about 20 years ago, and it's just expanded since then.
That's great. Let's for the benefit of anyone joining us who perhaps has managed to avoid the news entirely the last, say, 2 months, Tracy, can you set this up and just tell us why, as if anyone needs a reminder, but tell us why it is that this is a timely and important topic. What is the problem to be addressed with climate change and housing and disasters?
Well, I think what has created a newfound urgency, we've all seen and we have an understanding that the losses are mounting, and this billion-dollar disaster moniker that we're seeing now that NOAA's using is making that really clear, particularly in the pandemic that really was heightened. But in the news today, you're talking about Helene and Milton. There was Idalia right before that, right? 13-month span with storms coming with very different characteristics, with rapid sequences and changes in the way these storms are both arising and the hazards they're presenting. So our world is changing. But what I want to remind people is that as these events come and compound, the clock is then ticking on how we as a country respond, because we can't continue to take these blows, blow after blow. And our study that we did with the academies really highlighted that while we're talking about Helene and Milton, this has been happening. And we're seeing more and more of these compounding events, which is really, I think, bringing to my mind the importance of us having conversations about how we build better before, not just build back better.
Mm-hmm. Carlos, I want to ask you a version of the same question. And we're going to have time for this conversation to look at specific problems and even prescriptions. And I want to sort of, towards the end of this, I want to invite you both to offer prescriptions for policy change, but just still under the heading of setting up the problem. Carlos, tell me from your perspective how well the federal government does when it comes to broadly managing the challenges we're talking about. How much trouble are we in?
We've always been in trouble simply because of the nature of how we've set up the federal policy on climate adaptation in this country, which is entirely disaster policy. So we're reactive rather than proactive about anticipating future events. And as Tracy mentioned, these events are happening much more quickly, more frequently. And so there isn't the same amount of time to do all the same amount of repair and recovery, particularly in our housing stock. So the study that I've done, particularly for the long-term recovery, which is federal funding that's directed to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which isn't even a permanently statutorily authorized program in the federal government, it takes up to 4 years to rebuild some of that housing, particularly the multifamily rental housing stock, which is primarily where low-income households and lower middle-income households live. So we don't have that time between events now, right? We're talking about months between events, let alone the years that we've seen in the past. And so this is, historically, the programs were underfunded. We haven't thought enough about the pre-event. We think more about property values in our disaster recovery than we do about people and household recovery. So all of those create sort of a series of inequities. And now it's just going to be exacerbated because we just have less time in between events.
Yes. I sense that the later part of this session, where we talk about prescriptions, will be an excellent part of this session. Before we get there, let's start slicing this up a bit. Tracy, I guess let's start with the built environment. Give me an idea at a high level of where you see the particular vulnerabilities in terms of infrastructure and housing, and then let's talk about what should be done to address those vulnerabilities.
Okay. I will say that there's 2 elements that keep me up at night. So the first element, we could put away the topic of climate change and just talk about the simple fact that our civil infrastructure is aging. It doesn't have adequate capacity for the challenges it sees, even in growing population, independent of the additional stressors of our climate. And when we talk about something like housing, well, then we have housing inventories that unfortunately are not necessarily built to the latest model codes and leave us at tremendous vulnerability. And much of that, in my opinion, has also been created by decisions we made as a country that I completely understand, but we focused initially on life safety. Let us not have people perish in these events. And we've gotten actually quite good at that. We still lose lives, but we've really closed the gap there. But now we're hemorrhaging losses. And I think the challenge that I see is those losses, as Carlos said, they displace families. They lead to a manifold set of outcomes that are very much well beyond what we used to think about. As long as they survive, they're fine. They're not flourishing. They're displaced for years on end. Some never come back, right? They never bounce back. And so the fact that we focused on life safety as a target and built our code environment around that means that we tolerated losses. That was actually part of the calculus to make this feasible. But now we're seeing we can't do that anymore. So for me, that first issue is, how do you now shift a direction that is always focused on life safety to one that now focuses on outcomes and performance and doesn't tolerate the level of losses that actually can displace families, even though the home might, quote, survive, right? It didn't collapse. So that's the first issue, how we built our codes for life safety rather than performance. But then that second part, as we talk about climate, as an engineer, I'm concerned. Our codes are regressive. They model based on the past. What's coming next is hard to forecast. So the fact that our codes then have to now rise to a new level of challenge in predicting adequately the demands that we'll see, that's quite another issue that the scientific community and then the bodies that enact those codes and write them will have to grapple with. I highlight Hurricane Otis in Acapulco. That was a region historically designed for earthquakes that saw essentially a Category 5 hurricane, which was something we had not seen in that region. And you saw structures literally stripped bare. And so this starts to tell you that our codes are not built for purpose for what's coming next, not only due to the life safety focus, but what the climate is now imposing, and that we don't have the tools right now in the codes to predict and model well.
I want to just stick with you for a second to unpack further a little bit of that. In particular, someone coming to this fresh might be surprised to hear that building codes don't necessarily reflect the best available science and engineering practices to protect people and structures against these storms. They might also be surprised to hear that the way we build public infrastructure doesn't always best reflect the underlying science and the engineering capacity for resilience. We could, of course, talk about this for days, but at a high level, why is it that codes and infrastructure standards don't always reflect the best available standards for a more resilient built environment?
So, interestingly, I'll talk a little bit about, first of all, I think the human posture on this, as Carlos said, we've been reactive, right? And that reactive stance we've taken also leads us to underinvest in areas where we might want to build resilience to what could happen tomorrow. And I think rather than get into the complicated story of how we as a country have done the bare minimum, we adopt minimum standards, minimum approach to the way we do our infrastructure and our building inventories, because there are obvious economic benefits to that. It's very difficult to challenge us then to put extra money into these investments for something that could come, but I can't tell you when. There's been some great work done, by NIBS, the National Institute for Building Sciences, on the Mitigation Saves campaign. Shows that for every dollar invested, there are up to $10, $11 saved and avoided future losses. But when you actually test that messaging on stakeholders who have to go make those investments, they don't use that calculus. They're going to invest today and it's going to cost money. And that's going to mean compromises to other investments in that community or in that household or for that business. And if we then hope that they would make that investment and forego their needs today for a possible future savings of avoided losses, we've tested that messaging actually doesn't land well. So as a result, it's not surprising to see that not only are we reactive, we fail to proactively invest because it's not in the decision nature, if you will, of these individuals to bank on that with so many other competing needs. I fully understand that. So I think we have some real opportunity to show co-benefits today of investing in protection tomorrow. And if we could do that better, we probably can move people and our country as a whole toward planning for those rainy days on sunny days, right?
Carlos, this seems like a good segue into insurance, my favorite topic. You'd think, so again, conceptually, you could imagine a world in which the incentive structure just described is exactly the reason why insurers would be driving this, right? Insurers have the vantage point and the knowledge set to say, sure, you don't want to spend the money up front, but you should, because it'll reduce your risk and therefore reduce your premiums. And you see insurers driving this, and insurance would be sort of a spur towards more resilience. It's not obvious from my reporting on insurance over the past decade that at all captures what's actually happening. Maybe could you introduce for us the role of insurance in resilience and how you see that role happening in real life.
Sure, and certainly insurance is viewed as the signal of as the early signal for what will be happening in the housing markets in the long term. But it's important to take several steps back to the decades of 1938, for example, when we had the Great Mississippi River flood that eventually led to the creation of the National Flood Insurance Program. I mean, remember that the first property insurance in this country, going back even further to the Great Fires of Chicago, were because insurers, the building codes, the first municipal building codes in this country were created because insurers said they weren't going to insure properties unless cities created building codes. So there's an interesting interplay there. And I just to add on the building code conversation before we could talk a little bit more about insurance. I mean, it's important to remember that building codes don't affect 99.8% of the housing that exists in the country that already has been built, right? We don't really have retrofit codes in the United States, with very few exceptions, for non-climate related hazards, including seismic, the soft story ordinances in California, for example. So, and the other challenge is that building codes don't address all climate hazards. They don't address heat, right? Except for to the extent that buildings have the air conditioning and that sort of thing. So there are still some challenges with the interaction between building codes and insurance. So let's go back to the insurance question. So in places where private insurers have said they're not going to work anymore, either sectors or whole geographies, we're seeing this play out in places like Florida now and California, where they're pulling out even a basic homeowners insurance, because in California you can't your fire damages are part of your homeowners insurance. So it's a real concern that's going to be part of the operating costs for a lot of communities. I'm particularly concerned about the affordable housing sector, because a lot of developers and owners and operators of affordable housing, this federally assisted and state assisted housing, can't afford their insurance anymore, their property insurance and their hazard insurance, but they can't increase rents like it's happening in the private market. So in many cases, we've heard anecdotes about people leaving the assisted housing business altogether. I've even heard horror stories of people threatening to evict everybody in their buildings because it's cheaper for them to pay their business loss insurance than their hazard insurance.
Tracy, let's go back to you on this. I sometimes we'll talk to insurers about this, often in fact, and they'll often say what they'd like to see as a way to avoid steep increases in premiums and or avoid the need to pull out of entire geographies is they want better standards. They say if there were only tougher standards in the built environment to reduce their risk, that's how you get to a point where consumers have access to and can afford insurance. It's never been obvious to me how much of the picture that represents, but it's certainly a thing they say, and I believe it's true to a degree. Give me, in an ideal scenario, as an engineer, how much can better standards actually reduce risk such that we could get to a point where insurance premiums stop going up as much as they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, of course, building codes are the silver bullet in many people's eyes. And as an engineer, we know that we have the technology to build resiliently. It's a question of now, how do we do it? And that how then gets into a complicated entanglement of political will, human behavior, economic factors, you name it. One thing I want to flag before we go any further, though, is code adoption means nothing without enforcement. So when we go out after these storm events, I will say that as many times as we see a lack of code adoption and application and design causing problems, I equally see places where codes are there, buildings are new construction, and it was a lack of enforcement. Codes weren't applied properly or executed properly in construction, corners were cut, et cetera. So I want to say that if we ever got to the day where we had rigorous, let's say, nationwide building codes, and we adopt the latest model codes from, the International Code Council across the country, you still need that enforcement piece, and enforcement still is done locally, and we have to get that right. So peeling that back and then looking at the relationship between codes and insurance, I do believe, of course, insurers would love to see that, right? And that would, I think, take a lot of the concern off their plate. But it gets back to my earlier point. You can still sustain damage and loss in the current model of the life safety approach to construction that we have in our codes. So we won't solve all of the issues. And as Carlos said, there's a number of other climate issues that manifest in ways that our codes don't even tackle right now. And we won't even get into flooding and other issues like that, which really get into the way we manage water, which is outside my decision as a homeowner and the building code enacted. So I really am curious and interested about performance-based standards, what we call code plus construction, going above the minimum to minimize losses. Why do we care about that? Well, one, it reduces displacement and improves functional recovery, right? We keep buildings online, houses online. You've heard people talk about Babcock Ranch. We can explore that one if you want. But there's, stories to be told about housing and developments that can keep people safe and sheltered. And sheltering in place may become our new reality when these storms come quickly. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to get there, we've got to get above that life safety standard toward that code plus. Now, insurers are able to, and in many states have enacted carrots, incentives for the choice to re-roof, impact-rated glass, a number of other features that we know actually get you code plus or get you better. But we found that those signals and those incentives are not working well. And part of that is because it's really hard to go and claim those credits. So families go and they do the upgrades, they make those changes, and then they don't reap the credits. So that carrot's not working. Now, you might ask, well, why is the carrot not working? Well, outreach to people, communicating the steps needed and making that process easy to get that upgrade and then prove it to the insurer to reap the credit can be challenging. But the reason that's challenging is because the premiums they're charging in places where, the beach plans and the windstorm plans are there as a safety net at the fair, plans for insurance, the premiums are so low. If I'm insured, I don't want to give extra credits. So I'll make it really hard now to get the carrot and to actually reap it for the policyholder. So what we found is a lot of those are only working at the disclosure point during the sale, where the features of the home can be seen and then insurance can compensate with those proper carrots and credits. So the dysfunction in the insurance industry, the premiums they could charge and how much they themselves are hemorrhaging, has kind of made it to where even if we could put carrots in for voluntary upgrade, they're not working. And of course, if we raise the entire standard through codes, that'll be great, but I still believe life safety will only get us so far. We're going to need those higher performance-based standards. Yeah. So it's a complicated entanglement that we're in right now.
Carlos, I want to just turn to you and try to focus more deeply on what Tracy said. The thing that you both mentioned when we spoke before this event was codes are great, but they of course only affect new construction. The number I've heard is roughly 2% of the housing stock per year, more after disaster, but still it doesn't do much for those homes that are freestanding. If the carrots through lower insurance premiums aren't that effective in practice, what are some other ways that it might be possible to try to improve the resilience of homes that already exist through retrofitting or whatever else? If I'm a homeowner, and even if you're a homeowner who knows about codes and knows what your vulnerabilities are, it's still very expensive, I find, most of these retrofits. What is a way forward to better protect existing homes from the damages that we already know are getting more prevalent?
So first off, we don't know why they are not effective, right? So it's important to do better studies about why, if somebody does a mitigation effort, it's not compensated in their insurance rates. Certainly, people are doing these actions at the same time as their rates are becoming more actuarial relevant. So it's sort of just an imbalance of timing that's occurring. But it'd be helpful to see. I mean, Tracy mentioned the NIBS study. But we don't about the expected savings of $10 for every dollar that you invest now. But we don't know who gets that savings, right? Is it the actual household or is it somebody else? And so understanding the details of insurers' actuarial rates and their premiums is actually critical. There are other things that go with the insurance world in terms of claims treatments that would be helpful to explore a little more deeply. In a study I was the PI for in New Orleans, we asked people, and we certainly found that income and race were clear factors in disparities in claims treatment and insurance after events, after claims were filed. But let me answer your second question. It's about what people could do. So certainly we still encourage mitigation efforts because at least you're reducing the damages that any household are going to suffer and any property are going to suffer even if it's not reflected in insurance. But there's an interconnection between housing and infrastructure, and certainly Tracy and I could talk extensively about this, that we're just starting to explore as researchers. How much is the combination of regional infrastructure, the protective infrastructure that we've been investing in this country for about 100 years, actually helping that balance? There's an unwritten contract that insurers created after the Chicago fire and after a range of major specific hazards that occurred in U.S. cities 100 years ago, that insurers said, if you build, for example, X levee, we're willing to insure the properties that are behind that levee. That contract has been ripped apart over the last 20 years. So it's a question of understanding what that combination is of infrastructure, property level changes that could results in actual lives saved and property damages mitigated. There's a third thing that I think we can be looking at, and that is actual social programming. That's been highly underinvested in this country, even though we know, and I'm speaking specifically about heat, for example, Eric Kleinenberg's work in Chicago, where the communities that actually had broader social cohesion, broader networks in which people knew their neighbors and looked out for their neighbors, fared better than communities that did not. We don't know that importance of social network, of social leveraging, of community organizing that actually can prove to reduce damages in the long term as well.
I think this is the time to quickly segue into federal policy reforms, because we're going to be taking questions soon. There's obviously so much here, right? There's so many agencies that touch this, so much room for improvement. But Carlos, just starting with you, give me sort of top 2 or 3 reforms that you think would be used. Let's hope there may be some federal policymakers watching this right now. What are 2 or 3 changes that you think would be especially effective at reducing the level of risk facing homeowners in the U.S. right now?
So my colleague, Dr. Carolyn Kuski, and I did a series of blog posts and papers that was published by Brookings Institution last year, looking at that very question. What can we reform just in terms of disaster policy management and how it affects climate adaptation? And we started off with principles. So if anything, I would encourage policymakers with any authority in this space to focus on principles first, because we have such a mishmash of past programs, with the Stafford Act being at the core of how we address so much of our climate adaptation policy, that really a real reform has to look at broad principles. And the principles that we proposed were around equity, around effectiveness, evidence, as well as efficiency. So, and for fiscally conservative lawmakers, that's actually an important place, because we create a lot of moral hazard by funding a lot of repair and recovery and not funding the mitigation side. And then fourth, just looking at how the environment is changing, right? So if I were to give like my bullet, my silver bullet, there is no silver bullet because it's going to take a lot of different pieces. But I would say we need to have a different balance of the power between the federal government and state and local government. And that involves a lot of local capacity building so that they can make better decisions and utilize the federal and state funding more effectively, so that they're building in all the protections that they can. The second category, I'd say, would be really prioritizing the most vulnerable people in their communities. That not only means low-income households, households in lower quality housing, but also those communities that have historically been forced to live in places usually because of their skin color, that are highly susceptible to a lot of the hazard exposures that we're talking about. And that's a historical legacy that requires some reparation. So I would say those 2 strategies would probably be my biggest call to arms.
Tracy, same question for you. If someone's listening and we have persuaded that person that there's a problem here, what would you recommend they look at as 2 or 3 things that should change with federal policy on this?
So I want to ride off of Carlos's point, 2 of his points actually, because they align with what I was thinking as well. This idea that events have a discrete beginning and end. There's a hurricane and it ends, and everything is tied to that. And that's kind of how we built our entire assistance system, our claims process. They're all event driven. We started in the consensus study we were working on with the academies, looking at this idea of an epoch. And if you take that wider view, these issues around communities that historically have been disproportionately affected, and therefore their recoveries take longer. Therefore, it doesn't take a major disaster declaration to set them back yet again. Small storms, as I would call it, death by 1,000 cuts in communities that have limited capacity and resilience, are highly vulnerable and have been disproportionately affected and marginalized for many years, as Carlos articulated, they have a different threshold of exposure and vulnerability, and we don't account for that in any of our policies. And we saw that this death by 1,000 cuts, it doesn't take $1 billion disaster or even a major disaster declaration for a small and localized event, of which we'll have more of these in a changing climate, to affect these communities. So rethinking the Stafford Act for a time now where it won't be a single event with a nice clean start and end, and we all recover magically by the end of that period within a cookie cutter assistance system, but one that accounts for the hysteresis, the times that these people have been affected, their capacities, and the inequities that they faced over time that have resulted in these disproportionate effects, and accounting for that. So that's one that I would love to see, how we rethink. Is there a new rethinking of the Stafford Act for the new reality of a changing climate and the legacy of where these communities have been affected over and over and over? The second one I would come back to and also hit what Carlos says is the balance of federal and local. Local is so important. If it's not for the cohesion issues, which I 1,000% applaud and want to echo in his statements, it's also for the fact that even when we talk building codes, there are local issues. And that's why the local kind of adoption and tailoring of the codes historically has been important. It reflects we're a very diverse country, many different building styles and historical norms, and the codes are the way that a municipality or jurisdiction tailors that to their needs. So how do we then find the right balance of raising the standard of construction nationally while still allowing some local autonomy in how those codes that are enforced and enacted, while still maintaining, again, a minimum threshold of what we expect as a country? I'm a pragmatist. I don't think we'll have a national building code effectively adopted and enforced across the whole country to raise our standard together. I would like the federal government to create an enabling environment where localities can be encouraged to do the right thing and to actually have incentives to do so. Maybe some sticks, but either way, I think it will remain a state level at maximum, and maybe even a local level, more pragmatically, decisions, which makes a patchwork, regulatory patchwork. And that's not what I want, but I think that's where we are. So I'd like to see us create an enabling environment for that to happen, where codes can still be managed locally, but with some minimum expectations about that. And looking then at creating environments for new incentives to flourish. As Carlos said, a lot of dysfunction has led to where insurance is not providing the necessary incentives to retrofit, upgrade, or prepare, mostly because the credits would pay out quite slow compared to the upfront investment. But what we did find in talking to households, and that's where Carlos has the right idea here, we need to study this more, they would and do move the needle when the real estate market signals them back that they'll be rewarded when they sell that house. The value of the property starts rising. So part of that enabling environment I'd like to see is a world where we actually use real estate not as, a predatory force in building cheap housing en masse, but actually in sending signals in the way that we market and develop properties and even list them in real estate listings that showcases resilience features and gets those to be recognized so that the market signals can reward that by increasing values of properties, because households say they will move and make the investment today if when I sell the home, I can reap it tomorrow.
I want to focus on this idea of creating an enabling environment, and in doing so, I want to fiendishly introduce politics to this conversation. I was reading the Project 2025 document from Heritage, laying out plans that may or may not reflect President Trump's agenda for a second term. And on FEMA, maybe you guys have read this, and I apologize if you already know this. The proposals on FEMA are very explicit. They call for dramatically shifting the burden back to states and localities following a disaster, and say that for most disasters, you should have a 25% federal cost share, not 75%. And the rationale for this, which is why I'm raising it, is that that would pretty strongly incentivize state and local governments to, as you say, enable more aggressive action, whether it's codes, whether it's more public insurance for infrastructure, whether it's whatever, to have real, I hate the phrase skin in the game, but there you go. I've talked to emergency managers who are very non-political, who say, there's something to that. They note that the politics of it are very hard, but maybe it's worth considering having sort of a pretty aggressive rethink of the Stafford Act and the way that FEMA currently is not just sort of the last line of defense, but almost the first line of defense for most events. Is there something to that idea of using FEMA and specifically reducing the ability of FEMA to quickly help in so many events could that be a more useful inducement to get state and local officials to be more proactive on these things? I'll let either of you jump on that.
That's okay. So this is a tough one. So I have not read the Project 2025 document, so you beat me. I've stayed away from such things. But let me just say the following. You said the phrase skin in the game. And that was the phrase I jotted down when you started this line of questioning. I also feel we need to do that. What I'm worried about is an abrupt overhaul and withdrawal could leave many communities, like as Carlos said, their capacities haven't been built. They're not ready for these moments. And there'll be more communities across our country needing to be ready in these moments. With a changing climate, there'll be areas that hadn't seen certain hazards ever before needing to rise. Good example, right? The winter storm in Texas. They hadn't seen weather like that, and that threw the playbook out on them. So what I'm worried about is we need more communities more ready than ever before, in my opinion, for new hazards and dramatically changing hazard landscapes. And I think North Carolina is grappling with that right now as we speak. If we do a dramatic step function and pull out and pull back federal assistance as we know it, I think it would be catastrophic for them. So my question becomes, how do you create a just transformation of the federal-state relationship that creates more skin in the game, but doesn't immediately abandon localities to figure that out on their own, but invests in strategic and evidence-based strengthening and capacity building that gets them ready? Because locally, I have found, and I think Carlos will probably echo this as well, people know their needs better than the federal government, but they don't necessarily have the capacity or the resources or even the flexibility with the assistance they receive to solve those issues in the way that they would like to, or the tools that can help them make those decisions, right? And so as a result, leaving them in the cold immediately could be catastrophic. But is there a way that we justly transition a healthier balance and build up their capacity? Because they are the first line, whether FEMA comes or not, and their ability to be that first line is critical.
Just Carlos, jump in on that. We got just so everyone knows. So we're after this, we'll proceed to questions, and I've got a few already in front of me. So Carlos, if you want to give your take on that, and then in the meantime, anybody who's got a question they want to ask, please enter it, and then we'll shift to that right after this. Okay,
yeah,
Carlos.
so I definitely like to build on Tracy's comments. I should note that I did read Project 2025 in relationship to climate largely, as well as disaster policy. And there are other things like completely privatizing the National Flood Insurance Program, privatizing the Small Business Administration, which is the second aid tranche after FEMA individual assistance that we should be talking about as well. But just in terms of this relationship, we're in the blog series that I did with Dr. Kijewski, we definitely talked about the state deductible idea, which we don't think is a bad idea. The challenge is it's the unit of government that we're talking about. The Stafford Act creates the relationship between the federal government and state government, but we cannot equate state government with local government. There are plenty of municipalities and counties and unincorporated areas that are in direct conflict for a wide range of reasons within their states. Chris, I know you did some coverage of the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis a couple of years back. And this is another case in which the state government is not actually looking out for many of their local communities in a very proactive way for a wide range of reasons, some of them historical racism, some of them just political partisanship that are disconcerting. And so talking about Project 2025, we should talk about sort of the range of politicization that has occurred during Helene and Milton that is actually a bigger concern. Tracy noted that implementation and enforcement is just as critical as what's in the book. So not only should we reform Stafford Act to rethink this relationship between federal, state, and local neighborhood government, but also think about removing all politicization from these processes.
On that note, I've got in front of me a list of 8 questions that have been sort of distilled. I'm going to just go through them because I think they're all worthwhile. And again, if any more come in, fantastic. I'm going to just read them one by one and invite either Tracy or Carlos to jump on it. First one is on insurance. It reads, could we rethink different models for insurance? Is there a way to create a bigger risk pool? Carlos, do you want to tackle that, or Tracy? Either.
Sure. Certainly there are plenty of ways. I mean, one of the things that we've seen in places like Florida and now in California are the FAIR plans, right? The state government-backed plans that are essentially becoming the bigger distribution pool because people can't afford their private insurers anymore, or the private insurers are just dropping their coverage. So there's an interesting thing that's going on, sort of the nationalization of a wide range of insurance policies that's occurring. I've been saying this since Hurricane Harvey, and I'm happy to cite Daniel Schwartz, the law professor at University of Minnesota, just came out with a great article saying that we need to have the same conversation about property insurance as we had about health insurance under the Obama administration. We really need to rethink how private insurers can fit into a broader pool so that we're actually distributing risks appropriately, but incentivizing. Just like we'd be incentivizing preventative health care techniques, we need to start incentivizing hazard mitigation as part of that insurance schema.
I'm going to go through this kind of quick because the list is growing and I love these questions. Tracy, I think this is for you. How do we get the buy-in from the general public to mitigate or build stronger if the immediate benefits don't outweigh the costs? We kind of addressed this, but Tracy, give it one more shot.
Put a bow on it. Okay, I think there are three things we could do better. The first is we need to communicate risks and actionable strategies to address those risks to households, and we don't. In our work in North Carolina, pre-Helene, we found that less than 10% had received any outreach on how to ready themselves and ready their home for a disaster. That's a problem. Number two, it is correct that there is upfront cost. And speaking to people about avoided future losses, that's not going to help them recover those costs immediately. So co-benefits are key. The messaging has to show them co-benefits, whether that's in insurance premiums, whether that's in market value of their home, or co-benefits like improved energy efficiency. Many of the things you do for resilience improves the energy efficiency of the home. So let's bundle these and give people a 2-for-1. Number three, engineers need to make it easy. We often create retrofit scenarios that require you to rip apart the home in ways that displace the family and create a huge burden on them and a momentum to act, right? A barrier to act. Some of the new technologies can do these retrofits much easier. We need more engineers thinking from a household perspective, a homeowner perspective, and finding ways to do this with minimal cost as well as disruption, right? And I think then you'll make it much more attractive to move away for a day or two, let the retrofit happen and come home, rather than the prospect of being displaced in an extended fashion.
Next up, we got a flood maps question, my favorite topic. The questioner says that this year, Texas adopted their first state flood plan, and regional flooding planning groups found that in some regions there were towns whose most recent flood maps predated World War II. We haven't fact-checked that, but let's just go with it. How common is it across the US, and what efforts are being taken to update FEMA flood maps? Carlos, do you want to take that?
This one might be better for Tracy, but I certainly encourage more accurate data being produced. Tracy?
Yeah, it is really a challenge with the accuracy. So what I will say is compound flooding, particularly, is one of the things that, we're concerned about. The idea of these rainfall, riverine flooding, and then storm surge combining, very challenging to predict. So there's two things that we're seeing. Yes, flood maps need to be updated. FEMA is investing in this. Only as good, though, as the quality of the data and the models we have, particularly for some of the work we're doing with them now to forecast future storm scenarios, right? So they're outdated for today, and they now have to get ready for tomorrow. So we really have a lot of work to do to get that science right. But the other part I'll add is it's not just the flood maps. The more that our flood insurance programs can also recognize and account for in their loss models, the structural features or vulnerabilities. We often used to just focus on the hazard. You live in a floodplain. Well, if I'm in a floodplain and I have these features, though, what is my risk? Both of those are important interplays because the second then gives power for some of those carrots to upgrade and retrofit the home. More pronounced tie of that to their premium rather than just the way that the community rating system works as a whole.
Okay. This next question, I'm going to paraphrase it a bit, in fact, a lot. But this question looks at rebuilding in vulnerable high-risk areas. And I'm going to paraphrase it to say, what can we do to prioritize rebuilding in high-risk areas after disaster to reduce future risk? And I think this touches on a great question, which is after disaster, there's such political pressure to ease standards to make rebuilding as cheap as possible and fast as possible. when arguably from a long-term perspective, that's the moment you want tougher standards. How do you combine what should happen with what makes sense to sort of meet the needs and demands of survivors themselves? Either of you.
I guess I would question the premise that it's cheap. We try to make it cheap and quick to repair. Well, certainly, we try to make it quick because elected officials locally want to recover as quickly as possible, and people want to retain some sense of normalcy, whether even that normalcy was good before the event than it was. But I don't know if it's actually cheap. So the question is, what do we do to encourage people to think about their options after they're gone through a crisis? And that's not the best time to ask people what they should be doing, right? Because people want to just get back home. We've seen experiments occurring over the last decade that the buyout programs that I think are really promising, that are not just rebuilding, but actually giving people the options of moving en masse with their neighbors, moving individually, and what that looks like. That the best examples of which are like New Jersey's Blue Acres program, where they're actually providing wraparound services with that movement and with the property mitigation as needed. So I think in many ways, we haven't had a conversation in this country about the places we seek to maintain in place. Certainly, this came most strongly out in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina, where we said, let's invest in rebuilding New Orleans, because New Orleans is the epicenter of American cultural tradition, right? In so many ways. So there was an investment there, but then the suburbs, the outer parishes of the New Orleans area, kind of got displaced in a lot of that infrastructure planning. So it's a long-term discussion, I think, that we have to have about places that we want to enforce through major infrastructure, through mitigation strategies, as well as thinking about social programming, and then those places that we think we have to have a trade-off. I think in a lot of the conversation that we've had, though, we've been forgetting that a lot of the things that we're asking for not only cost money, but certain people benefit from that money. And certainly the low-income households in many of these places don't have the choices. We can give them more information, we can increase their insurance premiums, and they're going to be forced into the cheaper, less quality housing in many of these environments. So that actually has to be prioritized when we're having these conversations.
This next question, I'm just going to read verbatim because I think it's on point. What are the levers that influence building codes? Who are the targets we need to advocate towards? Tracy, you made the point when we spoke earlier that you thought getting tougher codes was sort of a political non-starter. Who are the actors that tend to speak against tougher building codes, and why are they so powerful?
Well, I think I've had this unfortunate professional experience in that I work on standards, and then the standards eventually become code, and then if code's adopted, there we have it. We've pushed to raise the standards for quite some time. I think the home builders and others, they also have their interests, and a lot of the trades, right? Every time that we elevate construction to a new standard, it requires retooling a workforce, having new products potentially, new code enforcement, training has to take place. It's expensive to do that lift. So I understand those resistances and critical lobbies that might say, oh, do we need to increase all of these loads in the prescriptive codes? Because that has a huge implication for products and services and the delivery of housing. And so I think, that's one place where the levers might look at is trying to consider how we can address the fact that we do often as a country lobby hard from the side of home builders and other allied industries against major changes that would cause complete retooling of their workforce or significant changes in their procedures and products. But then, on the other side of the coin, I'll say that nothing is stopping jurisdictions, though, from enacting stricter codes. And a great case study there is in Mobile, Alabama, Mobile and Baldwin counties in Alabama, which does not have the statewide adopted and enforced building code, but they locally did so at the county level. And they did very well in Hurricane Sally as a result. So I see a lot of bright spots with turning these levers at a local level, even while fighting against some of that momentum at the federal level in particular is quite challenging.
This next one is on renters. Super important question. It says, with housing costs so high, how do renters ensure that upgrades are made if there are landlords who have no incentive to do major upgrades? Carlos, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And we released a report that we did in coordination with enterprise community partners last year at Brookings Institution, specifically on disasters and renters. And unfortunately, renters are among the most vulnerable groups when it comes to a wide range of disasters, not just climate related ones, and including the chronic climate related ones like heat. When you're looking for an apartment to live in, the only thing that a landlord is required to tell you nationally is whether there's lead-based paint in the apartment, right? There are no disclosure requirements about risk. And so in many cases, most renters don't know what they're getting into. New Jersey just passed a law that includes renter disclosures in addition to homeowner disclosures that are occurring, rules that are occurring everywhere. But as the study that I did in New Orleans showed, a lot of low-income households can't really act on information that is provided in disclosures. They still have to take the house that they can afford in the place that they can find. So in many cases, more information isn't exactly the option. Renters talking to their landlords about certain mitigation efforts is only going to go so far because there are a lot of we should include the fact that there are a lot of small mom and pop landlords, right, who are renting the other half of their duplex and that sort of thing. And so there are a lot of great relationships, and certainly affordable housing developers tend to provide many more social services and community engagement with their tenants. But the reality is it's going to be a hardship for a lot of these developers, a lot of these owners to make any kind of mitigation efforts, particularly if the homes are larger. So I'd encourage folks to look at some of the things that Enterprise Community Partners did after Hurricane Sandy in New York, multifamily central in the United States, that looked at both the strategies as well as the financing tools. And this it speaks to the same conversation as the building codes. I think the problem is all of these individual things are putting the burden on one stakeholder group. And that's why you get the building community, the development community sort of afraid of the building codes because it's not reflected in the insurers, it's not reflected in financial tools, and it's not reflected in our land use and zoning policies. So I think all of these things have to be considered and calibrated in the local places in order to reduce that resistance.
A variation on that issue of information, I've got one question that reads, is there a good resource for home buyers to find out, one, areas with low climate risk and hazard, and two, specifics about the homes or the community's resilience and preparedness? If somebody knows to ask those questions, where should they go for answers to either of you?
Well, there's a number of tools that are actually being rolled out at the federal, state, and even at the local level that home buyers could use, I think, and homeowners could use. I think one of the things I worry about, though, is in a number of these tools, they are downscaling some of the models for particularly predicting things like floods in ways that are producing results with high levels of uncertainty, potentially inaccurate. So as a result, while some of this is being done, and I've seen some great work across the Gulf Coast now in some tools that are running out of Louisiana that allow people to see a profile of the home in a digestible format. There are other ones that I've seen that are tied more into the real estate industry that, and I want to name names to cause any kerfuffle here, that actually are downscaling models in ways that I scientifically don't think are very sound. And bad information is equally as dangerous, right, as a lack of information in people thinking they are not at risk, for example. So we have to be careful. My takeaway, though, is that we do need to get tools democratized in the hands of the folks who make decisions locally. And that's one of our challenges, right? A lot of these tools are behind the scenes in black boxes producing flood maps and things of this nature. One of the recommendations I made to the Climate Caucus and Senate was continuing to work to bring these tools reliably downscaled into the hands of planners. Some of the work we did in New Jersey was around that area where they could have access to these really refined models and that could actually predict reliably at a parcel level the risks a family is under and then the vulnerabilities of that property to those risks. And so I would say we have to do more work there. But you can see Flash has some tools. There's also tools like No Code, No Confidence campaign that all help you understand even the building code environment you're in. Because as Carlos said, the disclosure moment happens at sale for a homeowner and then never again. And for renters, never happens. And so we really don't know much about what we're living in, renters and owners alike.
Carlos, we got a question here that go ahead.
Could I just add to that really quickly? I mean, certainly
Yes,
on
please.
the data that's being presented, that there's a plethora of sources now in the last 5 years, I would say, to Tracy's point. And my concern is, of course, that it's becoming more confusing for certainly for home buyers and for prospective renters, because there are so many places that they can find information on. So I always tell people, think of it as like a range of consumer reports, right? You don't just go to one site and find what they say. You read a wide range of reviews to figure out what it is. And so that's the best encouragement I could give to individuals, is look for a wide range of sources about a specific property. So one thing is the data source, the other is the medium, the conduit for how a household finds out about these. And still, your realtor tends to be the biggest source of information. In some cases, it's an inspection report. And most of the home inspectors that do home inspections at the point of home sale aren't really trained in understanding mitigation techniques, so they can't even assess the potential risk that a house can go through. So that's a big problem. And again, I have to repeat the same statement I made before. That 46% of households in post-Katrina New Orleans did not read their disclosure information. So we could have a gold standard on information, but we have to do a better job of communicating it.
We're running down on time here, just a handful more. This one, I think, Carlos, it reflects on something you mentioned earlier. It says, how can we better incorporate metrics of health into code requirements for building performance during impacts from climate hazards? So I think to the point of building homes that protect, say, from high heat and not just storms and wildfires, is there some inherent reason why the code can't be more thoughtful on that, or are there changes to be made?
There have been changes that have been made. A whole section of air ventilation systems and air quality systems has been occurred over the last 40 years in the building code movement. And certainly there are great advocacy groups like the National Center for Healthy Housing, the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, that have been promoters of improved standards and building codes in household health. That's one of the areas where there are a couple of samples of retrofit requirements. We're seeing this played out in New York City with proposals to create mandatory air conditioning for all tenants. It's played out in other places like Montgomery County here in the Washington, D.C. area. So there are these examples of people pushing both retrofit requirements as well as new building code requirements in this space. So I would say stay tuned to that. But again, a lot of those requirements are going to add cost to the development and to the retrofit, which could play out in more unaffordable housing.
Yes. I think we're coming up on time. So I'm going to close on this following question, which is great because it is really our first stab at the issue of large scale migration. It says, how do we prepare for and adapt for disasters that impact whole regions and may demonstrate limits to climate adaptation and preparedness, necessitating out migration? What do we do to plan for a future in which large scale migration is an inherent part of adaptation? Tracy, do you want to start on this?
Yeah, I want to just say that this is probably one of the most important questions, in my opinion. I'm often asked as an engineer, can we just harden, build better, build taller, build stronger? And at some point, we're going to hit a limit because there are things coming I can't predict as an engineer over the next 50 to 100 years. We need as a country to identify climate havens, places that are away from some of the higher risk zones that are largely on our coasts, moving more candidly inland where there's water supply. But if we do that without thoughtful planning, we can just create a new set of injustices as we move through those transitions. So I think my call is to start thinking now about what those climate havens could be, then thinking about how we support their preparation to receive what could be outpouring of people into those regions, but do so in a way that's actually managed, rather than, as we do as a country so often, reactive. Because at that point, we probably will do more harm than good in readying the receiving community and justly welcoming our fellow citizens who might need to now find a new home. So I'd love to see more thought around climate havens.
Carlos, I want to come to you. Just before we get to Carlos, on climate havens, I've gotten so many emails, people in Asheville, North Carolina, in the last 6 weeks or so, saying, how could anybody have said with a straight face that the notion of a climate haven is real? I moved to Asheville as a climate haven, and look at what happened. Is the takeaway there that we should be more careful about which places we brand as climate havens, or is the takeaway that the whole notion of a climate haven should be heavily caveated?
The latter, and I would say there's no such thing as a climate haven. That's what I've been saying for quite some time. So I would agree with Tracy that I think there are opportunities to buy time through mitigation strategies, through broader infrastructure. But in the long term, I would disagree that there are climate havens, and what we have to do is reduce the damages that could occur, and not, in many cases, not eliminate them. I started a study on receiving communities in climate affected areas, and the reality is a lot of the places that have claimed themselves to be climate havens are going to change their tune as soon as they realize it's low-income brown and black people who are the ones who are moving into their communities. And I think Abram, another fellow reporter, Chris Abram Luskarten, did an amazing story looking at the question of migration and concerns about climate risk, largely feeding into the longer-term environmental movement, believing that migration is going to destroy local environments. I think we have to be very careful when we talk about these questions of displacement, because it's always the most vulnerable people who are cut out.
But just to push back on that a bit, I interpret you saying there's no such thing as a climate haven to mean there are no risk-free places, but there are places
Right.
that are lower risk. Is migration, if we accept that to be true, is migration then a part of the solution, though, if we just like take it off the pedestal a little bit, or you're saying migration is sort of a false hope?
Well, I would say that because we're talking about at least 12 climate change effects, not to mention other hazards that aren't climate related, right? There is no safe place on the United States, right? So I'm all in favor of moving people as they decide, as is appropriate, and where there is an inordinate risk. So that should certainly be part of the equation. I think buyout programs, the experiments that we're learning are wonderful. We have to start creating criteria so that certain people don't get to benefit from those more than others. And I've seen some of the tribal relocations that have occurred with the IIJA funding have been very heartening to see. So I feel like that I'm not averse to buyouts, and I'm not averse to saying, let's invest in the mitigation in those places that we want people to be able to move to. But it's not just like a movement to a new place. There was a great story that I did with that I responded to an NPR reporter in Vermont of a woman who had lived in Florida, suffered through Michael, moved to California, suffered through a fire, and moved to Vermont, thinking that she'd be okay, she'd be in a climate haven, and of course, she suffered one of the floods that happened 2 years ago. So I feel like there's that we should stop fooling ourselves and thinking there's no risk, because the general population is not going to understand that.
Yeah. I know we're crushing up on time here. Can we steal 2 more minutes? I just want to give you both the chance to offer any sort of concluding thoughts here. We covered a lot of ground. We've left out a lot more ground. Any sort of final remarks before we turn it back over to Laura?
I'll just do my punchline here is housing is critical infrastructure, and we haven't treated it as such in this country. The pandemic reminded all of us, for example, how critical housing was to our own health, safety, our work, our children's education. So we all know this now because we've all lived through it, even if we've not gone through a hurricane or a flood. And what I would say then is we need to, as a country, now start treating it as critical infrastructure. And that would be my call and my request to close today.
All right. Carlos?
I would echo Dr. Kijewski-Correa's comment about housing being infrastructure. But I should also say that I believe the housing and climate crises that we have right now are intertwined. You can't have a population that's housing precarious simply because they're out of harm's way, or that they're in housing or location without good housing locations, good housing quality, right? So economic development, household financial outcomes are part of the climate crisis response that we have to deal with. So we have to deal with affordable housing crisis as much as we deal with the climate crisis.
All right, Carlos, Tracy, that was great. Laura, back to you.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much for moderating this fantastic conversation. Tracy and Carlos, thank you for sharing your perspectives and all the work you're doing in this field. We've received a lot of requests for the resources that were referenced during this conversation, and we will work to make them available in the post-event email or on the site. We'd also like to draw your attention to our May climate conversation that dives deeper into the topic of community-driven relocation. Big thanks to everyone who joined us today, and thank you for your interest and excellent questions. The conversation was recorded and will be available to view on the same page immediately after we end. If you'd like to share feedback on today's event or ideas for future events, please take our survey. If you haven't already, please register for our climate newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn at NASEM Climate to get updates on all things climate at the academies. We will not be hosting a climate conversation in November, so please be on the lookout for the registration for our December conversation that's going to be focused on consumer products and carbon utilization. A final big thanks to all the National Academy staff who support today's event behind the scenes, and thank you all again for joining. Take care, and we'll see you again in December.